I'm Cynthia McConnell, 25, a career service member who survived a convoy bombing and clawed my way back. For years, I covered bills, put out fires, and carried my family. But when my sister moved to end my life while I was in a coma and everyone agreed, I made a decision that changed everything. Ever been written off by the people you kept afloat? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into it, drop where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up believing family was everything. My parents drilled it into me from the time I could walk. Blood is thicker than water. We stick together no matter what. Nobody else will have your back like family will. But somewhere along the way, that philosophy became a one-way street with me doing all the traveling. I was the middle child of three, sandwiched between my older brother Louis and younger sister Elena. Louis was the golden boy, charismatic, quick with jokes, always landing on his feet even when he screwed up. Elena was the baby, which meant she got away with everything while somehow positioning herself as the family's voice of reason. And me? I was the dependable one. Our house was chaos most of the time. Dad worked construction when he could find steady work, but his drinking made that inconsistent. Mom cleaned office buildings at night and slept during the day, which meant I did a lot of the parenting for Elena when we were kids. Louis was supposed to help, but he had this talent for disappearing whenever responsibility showed up. By high school, the pattern was set. I worked part-time at a grocery store and gave most of my paycheck to Mom for household expenses. When Louis got arrested for underage drinking, I used my college savings to bail him out. When Elena needed a dress for homecoming, I bought it. When the power got cut off because Dad spent the electric money at the bar, I picked up extra shifts to get it turned back on. "You're such a good daughter," Mom would say, and I lived for those words. I thought I was building something: trust, loyalty, a family that would be there for me the way I was there for them. I thought sacrifice was love, and love was supposed to hurt a little. College wasn't even a discussion. We couldn't afford it, and the family needed me too much. So I kept working, kept contributing, kept showing up. Louis moved out at 19 and rarely called except when he needed money. Elena went to community college, but still lived at home, still expected me to cover her car insurance and phone bill and gas money for dates. At 22, I was tired. Bone deep exhausted from carrying everyone else's weight while my own dreams collected dust. That's when I started seriously considering the military. The idea had been floating around in my head since graduation. The recruiters came to our school regularly, and something about their pitch appealed to me: structure, purpose, the chance to build something bigger than myself while actually getting paid for it. Plus, the benefits were real. Healthcare, education money, job training. A way out that looked like moving up instead of running away. When I finally told my family, their reactions were everything I expected and nothing I wanted. Dad was proud in that gruff way men of his generation expressed emotion. But he also made jokes about me being too soft for military life. Mom was scared and couldn't hide it. "Why can't you just get a job at the bank like Sarah Morrison's daughter?" she'd ask. Elena's reaction was the most telling. She was furious, not because she'd miss me or worry about my safety, but because my leaving would disrupt her lifestyle. "You can't just abandon us," she said. "Who's going to help with the bills?" Louis was characteristically absent from most of these conversations, but when he did weigh in, it was to minimize what I was doing. Most military people never see combat. "You'll probably just be filing papers somewhere safe." The assumption that I was choosing easy duty stung, but not as much as the underlying message that I wasn't capable of anything truly difficult or dangerous. These were the people who'd watched me hold our family together for years, and they still saw me as soft, limited, playing it safe. But I went anyway. Basic training was everything they said it would be and nothing like I expected. Hard physically, harder mentally, but in ways that felt constructive instead of draining. For the first time in my life, I was building myself up instead of holding everyone else together. The calls home got shorter and less frequent. Not because I loved my family less, but because I was finally learning what it felt like to be valued for what I could do instead of criticized for what I couldn't provide. My fellow soldiers didn't care that I'd never been to college or that I came from a broken-down house in a forgotten town. They cared that I could do my job, that I had their backs, that I showed up when it mattered. For the first time in my life, sacrifice felt like choice instead of obligation. I was still the dependable one, but now I was dependable because I chose to be, not because everyone else had decided that's who I was. I should have known that kind of clarity wouldn't last. I should have known that family has a way of pulling you back into old patterns, whether you want to go or not. But at 23, finally feeling like I was building a life instead of just surviving one, I thought I'd left all that behind. I thought wrong. The first sign something had shifted came 6 months into my deployment. I was stationed in Germany, running convoy security missions. Elena started calling more frequently, always with updates about family drama that somehow required my immediate attention. Dad's drinking had gotten worse. Mom was working extra shifts to make ends meet. Louis had lost another job. Always something that needed fixing, and always the subtle implication that I should be doing something about it from 4,000 miles away. I know you can't send much, Elena would say, but even $50 would help with groceries this week. $50 was a lot when you were making military pay and trying to save for your future, but saying no felt impossible. So I sent the $50. Then 50 more the next month. Then 100 when Dad's truck broke down. Each time I wired money home, I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But the requests kept coming, and they were getting more demanding. Elena stopped asking and started telling me what they needed. The rent's due Tuesday, and we're short 200, she'd say. Not, could you help with rent? But we need 200 by Tuesday. The tone of our conversations was changing too. Less gratitude, more expectation. When I couldn't send money 1 month because I was saving for leave tickets to come home, Elena was genuinely angry. You're making more money than you ever did at the grocery store. What are you even spending it on over there? What I was spending it on was building a life. College courses through the military education program. A car that wouldn't break down every 6 months. An emergency fund so I'd never have to call someone at midnight begging for help the way my family called me. Louis called once, and only because Elena made him. His approach was different, more manipulative, more calculated. He didn't ask for money directly. Instead, he painted pictures of how hard things were, how much everyone was struggling, how guilty he felt that he couldn't contribute more. I wish I could be the one helping them, he said. But you know how it is. I'm barely keeping my own head above water. The implication was clear. Since he couldn't help, I needed to help more. Since he was struggling, I should struggle less. And Elena was the worst. She developed this way of talking about my service that managed to be dismissive and possessive at the same time. Must be nice to have the government paying for everything, she'd say when I mentioned buying new boots. But when she needed money, suddenly my military benefits were our resources. But the worst part wasn't the money or even the manipulation. The worst part was how they talked about what I was doing. Elena had started referring to herself as the responsible one in family conversations, the one who stayed home to take care of Mom and Dad while I was off playing soldier. She'd rewritten the narrative completely, instead of me being the daughter who'd supported everyone for years before finally pursuing her own goals. I was now the selfish one who'd abandoned her responsibilities. Elena's really stepped up since you left, Mom told me during one call. Elena had been such a help that she was still living at home rent-free, still not contributing to household expenses, still expecting me to subsidize her lifestyle from overseas. But somehow, in the family mythology, she was the responsible one and I was the runaway. Louis played into this narrative too. He'd make comments about how some people get to start over while others are stuck dealing with the mess. Never mind that he'd been absent for most of their struggles. In the new version of our family story, my years of sacrifice had been erased and his intermittent presence had been elevated to martyrdom. I felt it happening but couldn't seem to stop it. Every conversation left me more frustrated, more resentful, more aware that something fundamental had shifted in how they saw me. I wasn't their daughter or their sister anymore. I was their safety net, their backup plan, their get-out-of-jail-free card. I started avoiding their calls. Not refusing to answer, just being busy when they came through. Training exercises, duty shifts, study groups for my college classes. I told myself I was just prioritizing my responsibilities, but the truth was I was tired of being treated like an ATM with a guilt complex. That's when Elena started calling my commanding officer. "Family emergency," she told him. "My sister needs to call home immediately." There was no emergency. Dad hadn't had a heart attack, Mom wasn't in the hospital, the house wasn't burning down. Elena just wanted to complain that I wasn't answering her calls fast enough, and she decided the best way to get my attention was to drag my military chain of command into our family drama. I was humiliated, furious, and for the first time, genuinely afraid that my family's dysfunction might start affecting my career. That night, I called Elena back. "Don't ever contact my command again," I said. "Maybe if you actually answered your phone," she shot back. "I wouldn't have to." That's when I realized we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. They weren't just asking for help anymore. They were demanding access, control, compliance. They were treating my military service not as my career, but as their inconvenience. And they were willing to jeopardize my professional standing to get their way. So I kept answering the calls, kept sending the money, kept making excuses for their behavior while making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate their needs. I told myself things would get better once I came home on leave. But deep down, I was starting to understand that the problem wasn't distance or miscommunication or temporary stress. The problem was that my family had never learned to see me as a person instead of a resource. And now that I was finally becoming someone worth respecting, they were more invested than ever in keeping me in the role that served them best. The convoy was routine until it wasn't. We'd run the same route dozens of times, checkpoint to checkpoint, watching for anything that looked wrong, seemed out of place, felt different from the day before. Iran had been heating up for months, tensions escalating in ways that made every mission feel like rolling dice. But routine has a way of making you forget how quickly everything can change. I was in the second vehicle, manning the radio, when the first truck hit the IED. The explosion was so loud it didn't register as sound, just a physical force that slammed through my chest and left my ears ringing in a silence that felt like drowning. Then came the secondary blast, closer this time, and our Humvee lifted off the ground like a toy. The next few seconds exist in my memory as fragments. The smell of burning metal and something else, something organic and terrible that I later realized was human. The taste of blood in my mouth. The weight of something pinning my legs. Sergeant Martinez calling for a medic, his voice getting fainter each time he said it. Then nothing. I learned later that I'd been unconscious for 6 hours before the medevac team could extract me. Shrapnel had torn through my abdomen and right leg. I'd lost enough blood to make the flight surgeon wonder if I'd make it to Germany alive. But the real damage was to my head, traumatic brain injury from the blast concussion, brain swelling that had the neurosurgeons talking about permanent damage, about best-case scenarios that sounded like worst nightmares. I don't remember Germany. 3 weeks of intensive care, multiple surgeries, breathing machines and feeding tubes and brain monitors that beeped constantly while my family made decisions about my future from 4,000 miles away. Elena was the one who initiated it. While I was fighting for basic brain function, she was researching living wills and advanced directives. While doctors were cautiously optimistic about my recovery, she was consulting with lawyers about medical power of attorney. She'd convinced herself and my parents that I was going to be a vegetable, that keeping me alive was prolonging suffering instead of preserving hope. She wouldn't want to live like this, Elena told the hospital social worker during one of their phone conferences. She's always been so independent, so strong. If she knew what she looked like now, if she understood that she might never be the same, she'd want us to let her go. The manipulation was breathtaking in its presumption. Elena, who'd never asked what I actually wanted from life, who'd spent the last 2 years treating me like a walking ATM, was suddenly the expert on what would make my life worth living. Elena, who'd resented my independence and strength when it didn't serve her purposes, was now using those same qualities to justify ending my life. Mom and Dad went along with it because they always went along with whatever Elena said. She'd positioned herself as the family's decision-maker in my absence, and they'd gotten used to letting her handle the complicated stuff. Louis was characteristically absent from most of the discussions, but when pressed for an opinion, he sided with Elena. "She's probably right," he told Mom. "This isn't what our sister would want." What I would want, apparently, was to die rather than face a difficult recovery. What I would want was for them to give up on me the moment my situation became inconvenient. What I would want was to spare them the trouble of supporting me the way I'd supported them for years. The paperwork Elena filed was thorough and legally sound. She'd done her research, consulted with attorneys, made sure all the documentation would hold up if anyone questioned their decision. She'd approached my potential death with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else, except this time, her efficiency was aimed at ending my life instead of improving it. But the hospital staff in Germany weren't in any hurry to accommodate the family's wishes. Military medical personnel had seen enough traumatic brain injuries to know that recovery timelines were unpredictable, that patients who looked hopeless sometimes made remarkable progress. They delayed processing the paperwork, asked for additional consultations, insisted on waiting for more definitive prognosis. Their caution bought me time I didn't know I needed. While Elena was making funeral arrangements and dividing up my military benefits, I was slowly swimming back to consciousness. The first sensation was pain, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to encompass my entire body. Then came awareness. Bright lights, unfamiliar sounds, the antiseptic smell of hospital air. The nurse who was checking my vitals when I first opened my eyes burst into tears. "Welcome back," she said. "We weren't sure you were going to make it." But I had made it. The brain swelling had reduced without surgical intervention. My reflexes were intact, my speech was slurred but comprehensible, my memory was spotty but improving. I wasn't going to be a vegetable. I wasn't going to need round-the-clock care for the rest of my life. I was going to recover, slowly and painfully, but completely enough to live independently again. The full scope of what my family had tried to do didn't hit me immediately. In those first few days of consciousness, I was too focused on basic functions, staying awake for more than an hour at a time, keeping food down, remembering where I was and why I hurt so much. The nurses and doctors were cautiously celebratory, talking about rehabilitation timelines and discharge planning. It was Dr. Patterson, the neurosurgeon, who finally told me about the advanced directive paperwork. He approached it carefully, watching my face for signs that the information was too much too soon. "Your family was very concerned about your quality of life," he said. "They filed some paperwork with the hospital administration about end-of-life care. But obviously, given your recovery progress, that's no longer relevant." I asked him to explain what kind of paperwork, what kind of end-of-life care. He was reluctant at first, but I pressed him. I needed to understand what had almost happened while I was unconscious. The details came out slowly, professionally, with the careful neutrality medical personnel use when they're delivering information that might be devastating. Elena had filed to have my life support discontinued. She'd argued that I would never recover meaningful brain function, that continuing treatment was prolonging suffering instead of preserving life. She'd gotten legal documentation stating that the family was in agreement about discontinuing aggressive medical intervention. They'd been 3 days away from pulling the plug when I woke up. 3 days. If the hospital staff had been less cautious, if Elena had been more persuasive, if the paperwork had been processed more quickly, I would have died not from my injuries, but from my family's impatience with my recovery timeline. I lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling for hours after Dr. Patterson left. Not crying, not raging, just processing the magnitude of what had almost happened. The people I'd spent my entire adult life supporting, the family I'd sacrificed my own goals to protect, had been ready to end my life rather than deal with the inconvenience of my recovery. Elena called that evening, right on schedule. Her voice was bright with artificial cheer, full of relief and gratitude that I was finally awake. "We were so scared," she said. "We didn't know if you were going to make it. We've been praying for you every single day." I listened to her talk about their fear, their worry, their sleepless nights spent hoping for good news. I listened to her describe how hard it had been for them, how much they'd missed me, how grateful they were that I was going to be okay. She didn't mention the paperwork. Didn't mention the lawyers or the advanced directives or the decision they'd made about my future. She talked as if my recovery was an answered prayer instead of an inconvenience they'd tried to avoid. When she finally asked how I was feeling, I told her I was tired and needed to rest. I hung up before she could ask when I might be coming home, before she could start planning how my recovery would fit into their lives, before she could begin the process of rewriting this story into something that made them look like devoted family members instead of people who'd tried to kill me. That night, alone in a hospital room in Germany, I understood with perfect clarity that everything had changed. Not just my body, not just my career prospects, not just my timeline for recovery. Everything. The fundamental assumption that had governed my entire adult life, that family meant people who would be there for you when everything else fell apart, had been shattered as completely as the bones in my right leg. They'd tried to pull the plug. While I was fighting for my life, they'd been planning my death. And now they were going to pretend it never happened, pretend they'd been supportive and loving and devoted throughout the entire ordeal. But I knew better now. I knew exactly what I meant to them, exactly how much my life was worth when weighed against their comfort and convenience. And that knowledge, bitter as it was, clarified everything. I was alive despite them, not because of them. And I was going to make damn sure they never got that kind of power over me again. Recovery was a different kind of war. Physical therapy 3 times a day, working muscles that had forgotten how to function properly. Speech therapy to smooth out the slurred words that made me sound drunk when I was stone sober. Cognitive therapy to rebuild neural pathways that had been scrambled by the blast. Everything hurt, everything was frustrating, and everything took 10 times longer than it should have. But for the first time in my life, I was fighting for myself instead of for someone else. Every small victory, walking 10 feet without assistance, remembering a conversation from the day before, speaking a complete sentence without stumbling over the words, belonged to me. Nobody could take credit for my progress, and nobody could diminish it by comparing it to what they thought I should be achieving. The medical staff at Walter Reed, where I'd been transferred for long-term rehabilitation, treated me like a person instead of a problem. They celebrated my milestones, pushed me when I needed pushing, backed off when I needed space. They didn't have expectations about who I should be or what I should prioritize. They just wanted me to get better. Captain Williams, my primary physician, was the first person to ask what I wanted from my recovery. Not what my family expected, not what the military needed, but what I personally hoped to achieve. I want to go back to active duty, I told him. I want to finish what I started. He didn't tell me I was being unrealistic or that I should consider other options. He laid out the benchmarks I'd need to hit, the timeline we were working with, the challenges I'd face. It was honest without being discouraging, realistic without being limiting. We'll get you there, he said. And I believed him. My family called regularly during those first few weeks of rehabilitation. Mom's conversations were all worried questions about pain levels and prognosis and whether the doctors were taking good care of me. Dad asked about the food and whether I needed anything from home, practical stuff that didn't require him to acknowledge the emotional complexity of what had happened. Louis called twice, both conversations awkward and brief, full of long pauses where neither of us knew what to say. But Elena called every other day like clockwork, her voice bright with forced cheer, full of updates about home that I didn't ask for and news about people I didn't care about. She never mentioned the paperwork she'd filed, never acknowledged what she'd tried to do while I was unconscious. She talked as if she'd been my biggest supporter throughout the entire ordeal, as if her dedication and love had been unwavering. I've been telling everyone how proud I am of you, she said during one call. How strong you are, how you're going to come back from this better than ever. The manipulation was stunning in its audacity. She was rewriting history in real time, casting herself as the supportive sister instead of the person who'd tried to end my life. And she was doing it with such conviction that I almost wondered if she'd convinced herself that the advance directive had never happened, that her version of events was somehow the true one. I started keeping notes after those conversations. Not because I didn't trust my memory, the doctors had assured me that my cognitive function was returning to normal, but because the gaslighting was so systematic that I wanted a record of what was actually being said versus what Elena was pretending had happened. The notes were revealing. Elena never asked about my long-term plans, never inquired about my career goals or what I hoped to do after recovery. She talked about when I'd be coming home, what role I'd play in the family dynamics, how my experience could benefit them. She was already planning how to reintegrate me into their support system, how to position my survival story as something that reflected well on all of them. But she wasn't the only one repositioning herself in the narrative. During one conversation with Mom, I learned that Elena had been telling people she'd been my primary advocate during the medical crisis. That she'd fought with doctors to ensure I got the best care possible. That she'd been the one pushing for aggressive treatment when others wanted to give up. The lies were so comprehensive, so detailed, that I realized Elena hadn't just tried to kill me, she'd also planned how to memorialize herself as the grieving sister who'd done everything possible to save me. She'd constructed an entire mythology around her supposed devotion, and now that I'd inconveniently survived, she was adapting that mythology to cast herself as the hero of my recovery instead of the author of my near-death. I told none of this to Chaplain Rodriguez, who stopped by my room twice a week to check on my emotional well-being. But I did tell him about feeling disconnected from my family, about conversations that left me more frustrated than comforted, about a growing sense that the people calling themselves my support system were somehow working against my recovery instead of supporting it. Family dynamics can be complicated, he said. Trauma affects everyone differently, and sometimes the people who love us don't know how to express that love in ways that feel helpful. I wanted to believe that interpretation. Wanted to think that Elena's behavior was misguided love instead of calculated self-interest, that my parents' emotional distance was protective rather than indifferent. But the evidence was accumulating in ways that made generous interpretations harder to sustain. The breaking point came during a conversation about my financial situation. Elena mentioned, almost casually, that they'd been discussing what to do with my military benefits if I couldn't return to active duty. "We just want to make sure everything's handled properly," she said. "You know, in case you need long-term care or can't manage things yourself for a while." She was talking about my disability benefits, my survivor benefits, my savings and investments. She was planning how to access my money in case I was declared incompetent or unable to manage my own affairs. She'd gone from trying to end my life to planning how to control my resources, and she was presenting both as acts of sisterly devotion. "I can manage my own finances," I told her. "Of course you can," she said quickly. "I just meant if you need help with paperwork or remembering payment dates or anything like that. You know I'm good with administrative stuff." Elena was good with administrative stuff. She'd proven that when she'd efficiently filed paperwork to discontinue my life support. Now she was offering to efficiently manage my money, my benefits, my recovery resources. She was positioning herself as indispensable to my future the same way she'd positioned herself as the responsible decision-maker during my crisis. That night, I called the legal assistance office on base and asked about changing my beneficiaries, updating my power of attorney documents, ensuring that my medical decisions would be made by medical professionals instead of family members if I was ever incapacitated again. The paralegal who helped me was professional and thorough, and she didn't ask why I was removing my next of kin from positions of authority over my life. But I could see the question in her eyes, the same question I'd been avoiding for weeks. What kind of family requires you to protect yourself from them? The kind of family that tries to kill you, apparently. The kind of family that sees your survival as their inconvenience, your recovery as their opportunity, your independence as their threat. The kind of family that loves you conditionally, strategically, only as long as you remain useful to their purposes. I'd spent my entire adult life believing that family obligation was sacred, that loyalty to blood relatives was more important than loyalty to myself. But lying in that hospital bed, watching Elena orchestrate a narrative that painted her as my savior instead of my would-be executioner, I realized that blind family loyalty wasn't virtue, it was stupidity. Some people earn your loyalty through their actions. Others demand it through manipulation and guilt. And some people, if you let them, will kill you while calling it love. I wasn't going to let them kill me. Not medically, not financially, not emotionally. Whatever it took to protect myself from their version of family devotion, I was going to do it. They'd made their choice when they filed that paperwork. Now I was going to make mine. The first decision was easy. No more money. No more emergency loans, no more helping with rent or car payments or utility bills. They'd been willing to end my life to avoid dealing with my medical expenses. They could damn well figure out their own financial problems without my help. The second decision was harder, but just as necessary. No more access. No more detailed updates about my recovery timeline. No more information about my long-term plans. No more emotional labor spent managing their feelings about my trauma. They'd forfeited the right to be involved in my life when they'd tried to end it. The third decision was the hardest of all, but also the most important. No more pretending that what they'd done was acceptable, forgivable, or motivated by love. Elena had tried to kill me. Mom and Dad had agreed to let her do it. Louis had supported their decision through his silence and absence. Those were facts, not interpretations. And facts didn't care about family loyalty, didn't soften in the face of apologies or explanations or promises to do better next time. There wasn't going to be a next time. I was going to make sure of that. The conversation I'd been dreading came 3 months into my rehabilitation. Elena called with her usual artificial cheerfulness, but there was something different in her voice, a tightness that suggested she'd finally realized I wasn't responding to their outreach the way I used to. "You sound distant lately," she said. "Is everything okay? Are the doctors taking good care of you?" "Everything's fine," I replied. "I'm focused on my recovery." "That's good. That's really good. But you know, we're family. You don't have to go through this alone. We want to help however we can." The word help hung in the air between us like a challenge. I thought about the paperwork she'd filed, the lawyers she'd consulted, the decision she'd made about whether my life was worth preserving. That was Elena's version of help. "I appreciate that," I said. "But I'm managing fine on my own." There was a long pause. Then, "Mom's been worried about money. You know how she gets anxious about bills. And with Dad's hours being cut at work." Here it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern about my recovery, not emotional support during a difficult time, but another request for financial assistance. Elena was testing whether my injury had made me more generous or more dependent, whether trauma had reset me back to my old patterns of automatic compliance with family demands. "That sounds difficult," I said. Another pause, longer this time. Elena was clearly expecting me to offer help, to ask how much they needed, to fall back into my old role as the family's financial safety net. When I didn't, her tone shifted slightly. "It is difficult. Really difficult. The rent's going up next month, and Louis lost his job again, so he can't contribute anything right now. We were hoping. We thought maybe you could help us out. Just until things get better. Just until things get better." I'd heard that phrase for years, and things had never gotten better. They'd gotten more expensive, more complicated, more demanding, but never better. Because better would have required them to take responsibility for their own lives instead of expecting me to subsidize their poor decisions indefinitely. "I can't help with money right now," I said. "I'm dealing with medical expenses and uncertain income while I'm in rehabilitation." "But you're still getting military pay, right? And you don't have rent or food costs while you're in the hospital." Elena had done her research. She knew exactly what my financial situation looked like, knew that I was still receiving basic pay plus medical benefits. She'd calculated that my expenses were lower than usual and determined that I should have money available for their crisis du jour. What she hadn't calculated was that I was no longer willing to set myself on fire to keep them warm. "My financial situation isn't something I can discuss right now," I said. "I need to focus on my recovery." "But we're your family," Elena said, and for the first time, there was real frustration in her voice. "We've always been there for you. Don't you think you owe us something after everything we've done? Everything they'd done. Like trying to kill me while I was unconscious. Like planning how to divide up my benefits if they'd succeeded. Like rewriting history to make themselves the heroes of my survival story." "I don't think I owe you anything," I said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This wasn't Elena processing unexpected information or recalibrating her approach. This was shock, genuine and complete, at hearing me say something she'd never imagined I would say. "What's wrong with you?" she finally asked. "This isn't like you at all." She was right. The old me would have sent the money without being asked, would have anticipated their needs and transferred funds before they had to request help. The old me would have apologized for not being more available, would have promised to do better, would have taken responsibility for their problems as if they were my own. But the old me had nearly died because the people she'd spent her life protecting had decided she wasn't worth protecting back. The old me had trusted family loyalty to be reciprocal, had believed that sacrifice was the same as love, had confused being needed with being valued. "You're right," I said. "This isn't like me at all." "Look, I know you've been through a lot," Elena said, her voice shifting to the patronizing tone she used when she wanted to position herself as the reasonable one. "Trauma can affect people in weird ways. Maybe you should talk to someone about these feelings you're having." These feelings I was having. As if clarity was a symptom, as if self-preservation was a disorder that needed treatment. Elena was pathologizing my refusal to subsidize their lifestyle, turning my newfound boundaries into evidence of mental instability. "I am talking to someone," I said. "My therapist thinks I'm making excellent progress." That was true. Dr. Kim, the psychiatrist assigned to my case, had been impressed by my emotional resilience and my clear thinking about future goals. She noted that trauma victims often struggled with boundary setting and self-advocacy, but that I seemed to be developing both skills rapidly. What I hadn't told Dr. Kim was why those skills were developing so rapidly. I hadn't mentioned the advance directive paperwork or Elena's attempts to rewrite history or the family's assumption that my survival was somehow their windfall. I'd talked about feeling disconnected from my support system, about recognizing unhealthy patterns in my relationships, about learning to prioritize my own needs for the first time. Dr. Kim thought these were signs of healthy recovery. Elena apparently thought they were signs of brain damage. "Well, maybe your therapist doesn't understand how important family is," Elena said. "Maybe you need to talk to someone who gets it, who understands that we're the ones who'll be there for you no matter what. There for me no matter what." Like they'd been there when they'd tried to discontinue my life support. Like they'd been there when they'd planned my funeral while I was still breathing. Elena's version of being there looked a lot like abandonment, but she was selling it as devotion. "I think we should take a break from these conversations," I said. "A break?" Elena's voice pitched higher, genuinely panicked now. "What do you mean, a break?" "I mean I need space to focus on my recovery without managing everyone else's problems. I need time to figure out my own life before I can worry about yours." "But what about Mom and Dad? What about the bills? What about everything we've been dealing with while you've been gone?" Everything they'd been dealing with while I'd been unconscious, fighting for my life, learning to walk again, rebuilding my cognitive function from the ground up. Elena was acting as if my medical crisis had been an inconvenience to them, as if my recovery was somehow preventing them from solving problems they'd had long before I was injured. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You're adults. You managed before I started helping, and you can manage now." "We never managed before you started helping," Elena said, the first honest thing she'd said in months. "We've been counting on you since you got out of high school. We don't know how to do this without you." There it was. The admission I'd been waiting for, the acknowledgement of what our family dynamic had actually been. They hadn't been supporting me or caring for me or loving me unconditionally. They'd been depending on me, using me, treating me like a resource instead of a person. And when that resource had become inconvenient, when supporting me required effort instead of just extracting effort from me, they'd tried to eliminate the inconvenience by eliminating me. "Then you'll learn," I said. "Just like I'm learning to do things I never thought I could do." "This is crazy," Elena said. "You're being crazy. You're going to destroy this family over money." Over money. That's how she saw it, how she was going to frame it for Mom and Dad and Louis. I was the selfish one, the ungrateful one, the one who'd turned her back on family over something as petty as financial support. She wasn't going to mention the advance directive. Wasn't going to acknowledge that she'd tried to kill me while I was unconscious. Wasn't going to admit that her concern for my well-being had extended exactly as far as her willingness to deal with my medical expenses. In Elena's version of this story, I was abandoning them for no reason. I was being irrational, selfish, damaged by trauma in ways that made me incapable of recognizing how much they loved me. "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm just not rebuilding something that was already broken." I hung up before she could respond. Then I turned off my phone, lay back in my hospital bed, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The conversation had been necessary, but it hadn't been easy. Part of me still wanted to believe that Elena's behavior was motivated by misguided love instead of calculated self-interest. Part of me still wanted to think that family loyalty was sacred, that blood relationships were worth preserving regardless of how toxic they became. But a larger part of me, the part that was getting stronger every day, understood that some relationships can't be fixed because they were never healthy to begin with. Some people can't be trusted with your vulnerability because they see it as an opportunity instead of a gift. Some families aren't worth saving because they were never really families at all, just collections of people who shared DNA and took turns exploiting each other. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be the daughter, sister, and family member they wanted me to be. I'd sacrificed my own goals, my own money, my own emotional well-being to keep them happy and stable and comfortable. And when I'd needed them most, when I was literally fighting for my life, they'd tried to kill me rather than deal with the inconvenience of supporting me back. That wasn't love. That wasn't family. That was something else entirely, something toxic and destructive that had masqueraded as devotion for so long that I'd forgotten what real care looked like. But I was remembering now. Real care looked like Captain Williams celebrating every milestone in my recovery. Real care looked like the physical therapy staff pushing me to achieve goals I thought were impossible. Real care looked like Chaplain Rodriguez listening to my fears without trying to fix them or minimize them or redirect them toward someone else's needs. Real care didn't try to kill you when you became inconvenient. Real care didn't demand access to your resources as proof of your love. Real care didn't rewrite history to avoid accountability for harm it had caused. My family didn't know how to provide real care, and I was done pretending that their version of love was worth accepting. I was done setting myself on fire to keep them warm, done sacrificing my well-being for people who saw my sacrifice as their right instead of my gift. The phone stayed off for 3 days. When I finally turned it back on, there were 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails. I deleted them all without listening. Whatever Elena or my parents or Louis had to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. I had more important things to focus on, like learning to walk without assistance. Like preparing for my fitness evaluation. Like building a life that belonged to me instead of everyone else. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own recovery, my own goals, my own well-being first. And it felt like the most radical thing I'd ever done. 6 months later, I was back on active duty with a clean bill of health and a new assignment that took me even further from home. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic about my recovery timeline, but I'd exceeded every benchmark they'd set. Physical therapy had rebuilt my strength, cognitive therapy had sharpened my focus, and the months of distance from my family's drama had given me clarity I'd never had before. My new posting was in Colorado, working intelligence analysis for a joint task force. It was demanding work that required security clearance and absolute reliability, exactly the kind of assignment that proved the military still considered me worth investing in. My commanding officers treated me like a valuable asset instead of a burden, and my colleagues respected my abilities instead of questioning my judgment. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who saw my competence as normal instead of exceptional, who expected me to succeed instead of waiting for me to fail. The difference was remarkable. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending on managing other people's low expectations until I was finally free of them. But the real change wasn't in how others saw me, it was in how I saw myself. I'd stopped being the person who automatically said yes to every request, who took responsibility for problems I hadn't created, who confused being needed with being valued. I'd learned to recognize manipulation disguised as love, to distinguish between family loyalty and family exploitation. Most importantly, I'd learned that some people would try to kill you while calling it care, and that protecting yourself from those people wasn't selfish, it was survival. My family hadn't given up trying to reestablish contact, but their attempts were becoming more desperate and less frequent. The voicemails I deleted without listening had evolved from guilt-tripping to bargaining to outright pleading. Elena had tried calling my base commander, but military personnel were trained not to get involved in family disputes unless there was a genuine emergency. Financial problems didn't qualify. Louis had sent a letter, the first communication I'd received from him in over a year, explaining that things were getting really bad at home and that maybe it was time for us to put the past behind us and focus on what's important. What was important, according to Lewis, was that Mom and Dad were struggling and needed help, and as their children, we had a responsibility to take care of them. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Lewis positioned himself as the peacemaker, the reasonable one who was willing to overlook whatever had caused our misunderstanding. He acknowledged that I might have legitimate grievances, but suggested that family obligation should take precedence over personal feelings. He made it sound like helping with their expenses was a moral duty rather than an optional choice. But what Lewis didn't mention in his letter was the advance directive paperwork. He didn't acknowledge that they'd tried to kill me while I was unconscious. He didn't admit that their current financial crisis was the direct result of losing access to my income rather than any external hardship. In Lewis's version of events, we were just family members who drifted apart and now needed to come together to help our aging parents. It was a completely sanitized narrative that erased the central fact of our relationship. They'd tried to end my life when supporting it became inconvenient. I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to say that wouldn't require me to pretend that what had happened was forgivable, or that family obligation trumped self-preservation, or that I owed them something more valuable than what they'd tried to take from me. But the letters weren't the only sign that their situation was deteriorating. Through mutual acquaintances, people from high school who still lived in our hometown, I heard updates about how my family was managing without my financial support. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty, but it was instructive. Dad had been fired from his construction job for showing up drunk too many times. Mom was working double shifts to make up for the lost income, which meant she was exhausted and resentful most of the time. Lewis had moved back home after getting evicted from his apartment, but he wasn't contributing anything meaningful to the household expenses. And Elena was discovering what it meant to be the only functional adult in a family of people who'd never learned to manage their own lives. The responsibility that I'd carried for years had fallen to her, and she was drowning under the weight of it. According to my former classmate Sarah, Elena had been asking around about financial assistance programs, looking into food banks and utility assistance and emergency rent relief. She'd approached several people we'd known in high school, trying to borrow money or asking for help connecting with resources. She was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be responsible for everyone else's problems, and apparently, she didn't like it any more than I had. The difference was that Elena had chosen to take on that responsibility by removing me from the family equation. She'd calculated that managing their dependence would be easier than sharing it, that being in control was worth the extra workload. She'd been wrong on both counts. But what struck me most about Sarah's updates wasn't the details of their financial struggles, it was how Elena was presenting their situation to others. She wasn't taking responsibility for the choices that had led to their current crisis. Instead, she was painting me as the selfish daughter who'd abandoned her family in their time of need. She got hurt overseas and just changed completely, Elena had told Sarah. We don't know what happened to her over there, but she's not the same person. She won't even talk to us anymore. Elena was positioning my survival as my transformation, my recovery as my deterioration. In her narrative, the person who'd been willing to support them indefinitely was the real me, and the person who'd established boundaries was a damaged version created by trauma. It was a brilliant revision of history, one that made them the victims of my injury rather than the beneficiaries of my recovery. It painted my newfound self-preservation as a symptom of mental instability rather than evidence of psychological growth. And it completely erased the central fact that they'd tried to kill me while I was unconscious. But the revision only worked if I wasn't there to contradict it. As long as I remained silent, Elena could control the narrative about why our family had fallen apart. She could blame my absence on trauma-induced personality changes rather than acknowledging the attempt on my life that had actually caused the break. And that's exactly what she was doing. Creating a version of events that absolved them of responsibility while positioning me as both mentally unstable and morally deficient. It was damage control disguised as concern, a way to preserve their reputation while explaining away the loss of their primary income source. I found that I didn't care about their reputation or their narrative or their interpretation of my choices. Let Elena tell people whatever story helped her sleep at night. Let her paint me as the ungrateful daughter who'd turned her back on family for no good reason. Let her pretend that my boundaries were symptoms of brain damage rather than evidence of brain healing. The truth didn't need my defense, and their lies couldn't hurt me anymore. I'd built a life that didn't depend on their approval or their understanding. I had colleagues who respected me, supervisors who trusted me, friends who valued my company without expecting me to pay for the privilege. I had work that mattered, goals that excited me, a future that belonged entirely to me. Most importantly, I had the knowledge that I'd survived something designed to kill me, and that surviving it had made me stronger instead of weaker. Not just the roadside bomb that had put me in a coma, but the family that had tried to finish the job while I was unconscious. They'd tried to pull the plug on my life, and when that failed, they'd tried to pull me back into their dysfunction. Both attempts had been unsuccessful, and both failures had revealed something essential about who they were and what I meant to them. I meant nothing to them beyond my utility. I was a resource to be exploited when convenient and eliminated when inconvenient. They didn't love me, they loved what I could provide for them. And when I stopped providing it, they stopped pretending to care about my well-being. That knowledge was painful, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to wonder whether I was doing enough for people who would never do enough for me. I no longer had to carry the weight of their problems while they criticized the way I was carrying it. I no longer had to set myself on fire to keep them warm while they complained that the flames weren't bright enough. I was free. Free from their manipulation, free from their expectations, free from their version of love that looked suspiciously like exploitation. And that freedom, earned through trauma and recovery and the painful process of learning to put myself first, was worth more than anything they'd ever given me. The phone was ringing again. 56 missed calls over the past week, but I'd stopped counting after 20. Whatever crisis had prompted this latest barrage of attempted contact, I wasn't going to be the one to solve it. I was building something better than the family I'd been born into. I was building a life. 2 years passed before Elena's pride finally cracked enough for her to attempt a real apology. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing intelligence reports in my office on base. I almost didn't answer. The number was blocked, and blocked numbers usually meant sales calls or spam. But something made me pick up. "Please don't hang up," Elena said before I could even say hello. Her voice was different, smaller, less artificially bright, stripped of the manipulative cheer she'd used in all our previous conversations. I didn't hang up, but I didn't say anything either. I just waited. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," she continued. "I know I don't deserve it after everything. But I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." "I'm listening," I said. There was a long pause, and when Elena spoke again, her voice was shaking. "I was wrong. About the hospital, about the decisions we made. I was so wrong, and I'm so sorry." It was the first time she'd acknowledged what had happened, the first time she'd admitted that there had been decisions made about my life while I was unconscious. But apologies, I'd learned, were easy. Explanations were harder. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do it?" Another pause. "The doctors said you might never wake up. That even if you did, you might not be yourself anymore." And I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me from what? From suffering. From living a life you wouldn't want to live. From being trapped in a body that couldn't do the things you'd always done. Elena's voice was getting steadier as she explained her reasoning, as she fell back into the justifications she'd been using for 2 years to avoid confronting what she'd actually done. She was still casting herself as my protector, still framing the attempt to kill me as an act of love. "And I thought I was protecting Mom and Dad too," she added. "From having to watch you suffer, from having to make impossible decisions, from having to deal with the expense," I finished. Silence. "That's what it was really about, wasn't it?" I said. "The money. The inconvenience. The disruption to your lives." "No," Elena said quickly. "No, it wasn't about money. It was about money," I interrupted. "You'd been depending on my income for years, and suddenly I was going to be an expense instead of a resource. So you decided it would be easier to cut your losses. That's not how it was. But it was how it was, and we both knew it. Elena's apology was motivated by the same self-interest that had motivated her decision to file the advance directive paperwork. She wasn't sorry because she'd recognized the enormity of what she'd tried to do. She was sorry because the consequences of her actions had made her life more difficult. "How's the family doing?" I asked, changing tactics. Elena's relief at the subject change was audible. "It's been hard. Really hard. Dad's been in and out of rehab, but he keeps relapsing. Mom's working herself to death trying to keep up with everything. Louis is Louis. He tries, but he can't seem to hold down a job for more than a few months at a time. And you?" "I'm managing. Barely, but I'm managing. I got a better job, moved us to a smaller place we could actually afford. It's not easy, but we're surviving." Elena was proud of herself for managing the crisis she'd created when she'd removed me from their support system. She was learning what I'd known for years, that taking care of everyone else was exhausting, thankless work that left no time or energy for your own goals. But unlike me, she hadn't had a choice about taking it on. She'd inherited the responsibility by default when she'd eliminated the person who'd been carrying it. "I keep thinking about what you said," Elena continued. "About us figuring it out, about learning to do things we never thought we could do. You were right. We did figure it out. But it cost us everything. Everything. As if their financial struggles were equivalent to what they'd tried to take from me. As if learning to be responsible for their own lives was somehow comparable to nearly dying and then having to rebuild everything from scratch while protecting yourself from the people who'd tried to kill you." "What do you want, Elena?" I asked. "I want." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I want to know if there's any way we can fix this. If there's anything I can do to make up for what I did." There it was. The real purpose of the call. Not to apologize for the sake of apologizing, but to negotiate a path back to our old dynamic. Elena had learned that being responsible for everyone else was hard work, and she wanted to share that burden again. She wanted me to come back and resume carrying the weight I'd carried before, and she was willing to apologize for trying to kill me if that's what it took. "No," I said. "There's nothing you can do. But if I could just explain, you tried to kill me, Elena." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Elena had been dancing around them, softening them with euphemisms and justifications, but I wasn't going to let her minimize what had actually happened. "You filed paperwork to discontinue my life support while I was unconscious. You convinced Mom and Dad to agree to it. You made the decision to end my life rather than deal with the inconvenience of supporting me through recovery. That's not protection, and it's not love. That's attempted murder." "I didn't think about it like that," Elena said, her voice small again. "How did you think about it?" "I thought I was being responsible, making the hard decisions nobody else could make." Responsible. Elena had positioned herself as the family's decision-maker, the one with the strength to make difficult choices. She'd convinced herself that trying to kill me was evidence of her leadership rather than her selfishness. She'd reframed attempted murder as family responsibility. "You made the decision to kill me without asking what I would want," I said. "You never consulted with me about my own life. You just decided that I'd be better off dead and took steps to make that happen. But you were unconscious. We couldn't ask you. But you could have waited. You could have given me time to recover. You could have assumed that I'd want to fight for my life instead of assuming that I'd want to give up on it. The doctors said I might not recover. They didn't say I wouldn't recover. There's a difference between possible outcomes and certain ones, and you chose to treat the worst-case scenario as if it was inevitable." Elena was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different again, flatter, more defeated. "I can't change what I did," she said. "I can't take it back or make it not have happened. But I can tell you that I regret it every single day and that I'd do anything to earn your forgiveness." Forgiveness. The word that family members always reached for when they'd done something unforgivable. The magic eraser that was supposed to restore relationships to their previous state regardless of how much damage had been done. But forgiveness wasn't something you could earn or deserve or negotiate your way into. It was something you could receive, If the person you'd hurt was willing to give it, but it wasn't something you could demand or expect or manipulate someone into providing. And even if I forgave Elena for trying to kill me, which I wasn't sure I ever could, forgiveness wouldn't change the fundamental truth about who she was and what she was capable of doing when my existence became inconvenient to her. People who try to kill you once will try to kill you again. Maybe not medically, maybe not legally, but in all the small ways that people destroy each other when they can't control them anymore. Elena had shown me exactly how much my life was worth to her, and that knowledge couldn't be unknown. I don't forgive you, I said. And I don't want a relationship with you or anyone else in the family. What you did showed me who you really are, and I'm not interested in pretending it didn't happen or that it doesn't matter. So that's it? Elena asked. You're just going to cut us off forever? No matter what we do, or how sorry we are, or how much we need you. Need me. Even in her apology, Elena was focused on what I could provide rather than what she had taken. She was sorry about the consequences of her actions, not the actions themselves. She regretted losing access to my support, not attempting to end my life. That's it, I said. I hung up before she could respond, before she could launch into another explanation or justification or plea for reconsideration. I'd heard enough. More than enough. The conversation had been necessary, but it had also been clarifying. Elena's apology had revealed that she still saw me primarily as a resource, that her regret was motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse. She was sorry that her attempt to kill me had backfired, not sorry that she'd made the attempt in the first place. That night, I updated my emergency contact information one final time, removing the last traces of my family from my official records. If something happened to me, if I was injured again or killed in action or died in some random accident, they wouldn't be notified. They wouldn't be involved in decisions about my medical care or my funeral arrangements or the distribution of my assets. They'd forfeited those privileges when they'd tried to kill me. And they'd confirmed that they'd make the same choice again if given the opportunity. I was building something better than the family I'd been born into. I was building a life that couldn't be terminated by people who saw my survival as their inconvenience, who mistook their needs for my obligations, who confused love with exploitation. The phone wasn't ringing anymore. 56 missed calls had turned into silence, and silence was exactly what I'd been working toward all along. Not revenge, that would have required me to care about hurting them the way they'd hurt me. Not punishment, that would have required me to invest energy in making sure they suffered consequences for their choices. Just boundaries. Clear, firm, non-negotiable boundaries that protected my life from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with it. I stared at the phone for a long time, remembering all the calls I'd answered over the years, all the crises I'd solved, all the money I'd sent, all the sacrifices I'd made for people who'd been willing to sacrifice me the moment supporting me became inconvenient. Then I turned the phone face down and got back to work. I had intelligence reports to review, a career to build, a life to live. A life that belonged to me instead of everyone else, a life that couldn't be ended by family vote, a life that was worth protecting from the people who'd tried to destroy it. The power was mine now. All of it. And I intended to keep it that way. That's how I learned the hard truth. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for will try to take everything from you. I chose to protect myself, and I don't regret it. Have you ever had family or people close to you cross a line you couldn't forgive? Did you cut them off or try to rebuild? Drop your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. And if you want more true stories about setting boundaries, self-worth, and survival, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.